In We Should Be So Lucky, Andrew Lowe uncovers the real secret behind Australia's success. With sharp insight, he shows that the unusual prosperity and quality of life in Australia, often attributed to luck, actually derives from a unique blend of political, social and economic institutions and values that could be replicated by other liberal democracies. The Australian way works and contains many crucial lessons for other countries. Andrew, how does it feel to have something in common with the great Shane Warne? You've read as many books as you've written.
Well, I'm glad you've at least read it, Joe. Yeah, I think the same comment's been made about one Donald Trump as well.
Thank you very much. I actually have read the book, which is there. You begin the last chapter of the book with a famous quote from Donald Horne. Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share in its luck. It lives mostly on other people's ideas, and though the ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders lack curiosity about the events that surround them. A nation more concerned with the styles of life than achievement done in a social climate inimical to originality and the desire for excellence. According to the rules, Australia has not deserved its great fortune. Now, I know you disagree with that. It's a very readable 230-page response to that statement. Tell us, what was the acorn that led to this great oak of a book, Andrew?
Yeah. So I guess I've always been interested in what makes Australia different. I came to Australia when I was 8 years old, having been born in Namibia. Went straight into Mount Isa, so right to the heart of the traditional kind of images of Australia, and then spent time in Sydney. And then in my adult life, I've spent a lot of time living in Asia, Europe and North America. And what struck me particularly over the last sort of 10 or 20 years is that while there's a lot of affection for Australia, there's not a lot of real understanding of how our political institutions are different. The way we do healthcare is different. The way we do education, the way we do pensions, and all those sorts of things. And I thought that not only do we do it differently, but actually there's a lot of evidence that we, in many cases, do it better. Australians live longer. We have a higher median level of wealth. If you have a heart attack or a diagnosis for breast cancer, you live longer in Australia, and so on and so on. And so I thought it was time for someone to tell that story. It's the story that's less told, I suppose, the positive story about Australia. That although we focus on the problems that we have and the things we'd like to fix, it's sometimes useful just to take a step back, look at the big picture, and realise that we also get a lot of things right.
And this book, first edition, cost 8 shillings and sixpence, by the way. It was a book of its time, and I don't think you're attacking that book at all, are you? Yeah.
No, I mean, look, I think when you reread it, and I obviously reread it several times in the course of doing my book, Joe, there are a lot of things that do still resonate, and particularly around Australian values and character. Those sorts of things change, but I think Horne was probably underestimated some of the things that Australia had done, particularly around its institutions. And then the second thing is that if you look at the taking level of wealth as one example, you had a great period in Australia from about 1850 to 1890, where pre-Federation we became the wealthiest people in the world. We then sort of went on a downward path until about the time that Horne was writing. And then we saw in the 70s, particularly the 80s and 90s, Australia did really adapt. You've had the rise of cheap jet travel, broadband, the move of the world's economic centre of gravity towards our time zone. You also had, which was very good for Australia in hindsight, when the UK joined the European Common Market in the late 60s, that actually forced us to take Asia seriously and to really engage with Japan and Korea, and then subsequently China. So I think there were probably some things where Horn was maybe overly harsh, particularly around our institutions and so on. But I think also the world changed. You know?
Yeah, I think his cover art's better than yours, by the way.
It's an iconic cover, that one, isn't it?
I think we'll talk about the Australian way, and before we do, I think if I'm to reduce it down to something, it's pragmatic in approach, your assessment or your book, positive in outlook, and sees productivity as the antidote. You talk about productivity a lot. So the 3 Ps. Yep. The 3 Ps according to Andrew Lowe.
So I do characterise the Australian character as sceptical pragmatism. You know, we're not cynical, but we are pretty sceptical, particularly of the people who want to lead us, but just sceptical of things in general. But at the same time, when something does make sense and we see something that works overseas, we're actually very pragmatic. We're not ideological or sort of nostalgic in the way that some countries are. We do get on with it, and we're actually very good innovators as well. So I think sceptical pragmatism is a big part of the Australian character.
Do you think that scepticism is an accident or it's by design? Tell me how you think we've got to that point.
Yeah, so I think some of it comes from the heritage, the countries that were most predominant in the population at the time of federation. Have always tended to be a bit more pragmatic, but I think that was accentuated with this new country where the climate is harsh. You're a long way from everywhere. You've got people reinventing themselves. We've obviously had a particularly strong migrant population. A quarter of Australians, like me, were born overseas. More than half have at least one parent that was born overseas. So I think all of that breeds a character which is adaptable and flexible, and actually quite good at just getting on with things.
You talk about, as part of the Australian way, the framework of laws that the average person responds to here. You say it's a hybrid culture based on, Eurasian in lifestyle anchored in the norms of British settlement. Yeah. In a recent, and I want to talk about citizen education a little bit, I think. In a recent article in The Australian, Peter Credlin was talking about Australian values being at risk, saying poor citizen testing has led to a concept of Hotel Australia. People see Australia as a stopping point, but don't really buy in culturally to who we are. What do you think? And I think there's some truth in that, but it's unfair too. What's your sense of that, and what do we do about civics to help address that?
Yeah, so I think, as you say, there's a balance there, because overall we've actually been remarkably successful at having all the benefits of this very diverse, energetic population of people coming in from all parts of the world, but actually maintaining our social cohesion. Now, we've obviously seen that not everyone has bought into that, and then the question is, to the extent that there are minorities in the population who are not adopting those Australian values, are not understanding those Australian institutions, how do you stop that? And civic education, I suppose, is a part of that. But I think we need to be quite clear about what are the things that people must buy into. Peaceful resolution of disputes. You don't resort to violence. You don't do those sorts of things. But at the same time, we can actually live with quite a variety of different views on other things in a sort of tolerant society where everyone gets on with things.
Well, one of the things you talk about is the lessons that we learn from the Australian way, and you identify a few things I want to touch on. You talk about updating our democracy for the 21st century. You say the upper house has served us well, and I think that is true in the long run. I was reading again, Beach Energy CEO Brett Woods said the other day about energy policy. a minority government risks handing over exorbitant power to a collection of shuttered MPs, wholly concerned with their narrow agenda rather than the greater good of the nation. Tell me how you think our political system will serve us well in that environment, particularly given what we could face.
Yeah. Well, let's. I mean, first. Go back to the big picture. Australia was, although we think of ourselves as quite a young democracy, in fact, there's only about a dozen countries that have been continuously democratic from 1901, when Australia had federation, to now. Notably, obviously, people like Japan and Germany went on a different course in the 1930s and so on, and we were actually one of the first places to have an almost universal franchise, to not have a property requirement, that you had to be of a certain level of wealth to vote. We were the first to introduce the female franchise, 20 years ahead of the UK. On that, we have this mix of compulsory voting and preference voting in the lower house, which tends to drive the debate towards the centre. So it's less about let's get my team angry enough to get to the polls. Politicians have to go towards the middle. So I think all of that stuff works very well. I think the federal structure, for all its frustrations, does allow the country to be levelled up, is the phrase they use in the UK, in a way that other systems don't. So that's the good news. As you say, the fact that the political institutions are responsive to what people want is a good thing. But it does sometimes mean that if people are not convinced that the major parties are giving them what they want, they elect some other people who can come a bit out of left field, and you deal with that. But I think that's still a better outcome than having a situation where the Parliament doesn't have the legitimacy that comes from actually reflecting the kind of people that want to be elected. So there have been, with the Senate, some I think constructive reforms to avoid people getting in with very small proportions of the vote. I think having some sort of de minimis kind of requirement is fine, and I think that that has happened. But I'd really be challenging the major parties to say that if some of these people are getting elected in, it's probably reflecting the fact that you're not speaking to the concerns of the people that are putting them in there.
Indeed, and you talk about reform from the centre, particularly over the last 30 years, where we've had a succession of good Labor and Liberal governments who have led well from the centre.
Yep,
and I think that has discouraged that.
Particularly in the 80s and 90s, I think that was certainly true.
Do you think so? And you mentioned that we're one of 12 or so democracies that have operated stably. Do you think there's something? And you also mentioned in America there's a hunt for votes. Do you think our democracy, which was gifted to us, really? We had a colonial system, and we adopted this. We didn't fight for it.
Yeah. So
is there something in that?
Yeah. So we definitely evolved. We obviously came to the Australian uniqueness through evolution rather than revolution. Yeah. And as you say, particularly somewhere like America, where people very much define themselves as against the government, and that really permeates the whole way that a lot of people think about government in the thing of having to take up arms against the suppressive regime. We've not had that, and we've not had that. Now, I think it's a good thing that we haven't had that. And I think the prosperity that Australians enjoy, the 5 years longer lifespan than Americans. Actually, our median wealth is almost twice as much as America. They have a high GDP per capita, but it's very concentrated among a relatively small number of people. So I think all of those things suggest that we haven't actually been disadvantaged by the fact that maybe we haven't. We've evolved rather than rather than sort of created from a blank sheet of paper, our democracy.
One of the other things you say is the quality of the institutions that we have. You mentioned those at the start. I agree with your point about the Productivity Commission. You say that there's a lot of good work done there that isn't published, recognised or understood. It's certainly the case in my industry. Yep. Do you want to talk a bit about productivity and what can be done to bring that forward?
Yeah, so I think that is a real challenge for Australia. The over the long term, your ability to become more prosperous and for people to enjoy the kind of quality of life that we do comes to having a more productive economy. And in the 80s and 90s, we were growing productivity around 2%, then it sort of slipped back to 1%, and now it's kind of going backwards. And that is an issue. I think in a way, we've sort of become a victim of our own success because things are actually pretty good. There's not a lot of votes, there's not a lot of incentive or motivation to actually make hard decisions. So, a lot of these recommendations and findings of the Productivity Commission are beneficial to 95% of the population, but they do require a small part of the population to give up some monopoly rents that they're enjoying or some things that they find comfortable. And in a situation where you don't feel the real urgency, the politicians are kind of inclined to just let that go rather than actually make those those decisions that are in the longer term interest.
And one of the things I spoke about with a previous guest was the disconnect between our politicians' terms and long-term reform, and the kind of reforms we need are long-term reforms. They're difficult for governments to implement and talk to and sell.
Yeah. No, I think there is an element of that. We've moved now to 4-year terms in the state parliaments, and I think that having a 4-year fixed term federally would be a positive thing, as you say, for allowing political leaders to take longer term decisions. Having said that, I do think that sometimes people hide behind that a bit. This whole notion that reform is not possible, I think is a bit of a cop-out. I think it's always going to be difficult. It was difficult in the 80s and the 90s, and let alone in the in the late 19th century. But you need to. It comes back to us as voters electing people who actually articulate that they want to do things, rather than electing people who are in it for their career and actually give us the sugar hits and the band-aids that we want. So unfortunately, as we've seen with this election that's coming up, it is going to be band-aids and sugar hits.
It is.
Yeah.
And so things like housing that we seem to continually stuff up. One of the things you say is Australia's approach to broad-based property ownership has been key to the development of that.
Yep, and to our values and to
Yes.
that egalitarianism and social cohesion.
And you also said
all the
that,
things that we
I
have.
think it was a Productivity Commission report that said a 10% increase in the housing stock would decrease prices by 25%. What's going wrong with all that? Why is it just seem to be a system of insolvent builders and council regulations?
Yeah. So it gets back to there are some things that can be helpful at the margins around tax policy and social housing and so on, but ultimately the thing that's really going to move the dial is just building more houses. And why are we not doing it? It's partly planning approvals that state governments have delegated approvals to councils, who often take a long time, make it very bureaucratic, make it much more expensive to do. We have not been good at bringing in tradies and electricians and people that can actually build the housing stock. There's a lot of inflexibility around the way industrial relations work, particularly on bigger projects. So there's just a lot of inflexibility and extra cost that we build into the whole process of building houses, which is unnecessary. There are some signs that now the pressure from young people who are being locked out of the housing market is reaching a point where people are realising that we do need to do something. But again, there are plenty of reports on what needs to happen. It just needs the political will to push through with it.
I'm jumping around a bit as the book does, but one of the things you also talk about is Australia as a beneficiary of the global rule of order and Pax Americana. That's been a long 80-year journey. Now, are we seeing real change here, do you think? Do you think and you also talk about our diplomacy needing to be better resourced. I think that's true. We're seeing a slightly different New World Order with a different government. We're seeing the emergence of sovereign individuals playing key roles. How do you think Australia should be responding, both diplomatically and otherwise, to those challenges?
No, look, I think it's going to require a lot more dexterity and a lot more focus than we've had in the past. That post-war system that America set up at a time when it was more than half of the world's GDP, 70% of the world's reserves, etc., has been great for Australia and has meant that we really haven't had to do as much thinking about individual relationships with different countries in the region we now live. And I think it was evident before, but is even more evident now because Trump, in his inimitable way, has invested with a lot of drama. That we now live in a world where there are going to be some things where we're aligned with America. There are going to be other things, particularly around trade and international cooperation on health and those sorts of things, where we will be we won't necessarily be aligned with the US, and so the ability to both have a foreign service, but also mobilise the Australian diaspora. We've got this million-odd Australians that are living in different parts of the world who are very happy to be part of Team Australia. And so we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be engaged in Asia, but we also need to maintain relationships with like-minded countries that might be in Europe and other parts of the world. We need to continue to get the benefits of what's happening in places like China, but at the same time also lean into the things where the relationship with America is positive for us.
Do you think that needs a more muscular style of leadership?
I think it needs a more overtly Australian national interest focus. So I think it does mean more hard power. We need to be more take more responsibility for our own defence and be investing in things rather than just hoping that there's an American umbrella that'll just take care of it. And we need to be making we need to be strengthening ourselves in other ways too, because I think it's very disappointing that foreign investment has fallen as a proportion of GDP into Australia to about half of what it was, basically because we have gone from being very open to being the fifth most restrictive country in the OECD in terms of how we approach foreign investment. So it's not that people don't want to invest in Australia, it's just that we're making it hard for them. And I don't think we have the luxury of doing that in the future.
You talk about chewing gum, walking at the same time. You talk about China. Agricultural and mining products from Australia feed and power China, and Chinese people pay Australia for education and tourism. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers enable Australians to enjoy clothes, electronics, etc. Do you think we should, as part of that, promote ourselves far more aggressively as the world's food and energy bowl? We have this, we're resource rich, we're an island, strong in agricultural background. Do you think we're devoting enough to the primary sector? Should we be digging up more coal and minerals and powering the world and feeding the world?
Yeah. Look, I think the
reality... Or are we soft on that?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we're clearly very good at that. I think one of the great myths that I try to address in this book is this notion that Australia is rich because we just happen to have a lot of iron ore sitting around in the Pilbara.
Yeah.
Because lots of countries have great resource endowments. The Congo, Kazakhstan, famously Argentina had a similar sort of position to Australia in the early 20th century. The reason it's worked in Australia is that we've had good education, good engineers, a strong financial system that can bankroll these big projects, a political stability and a rule of law that allows Japanese companies, for instance, to be able to make these 30-year investments in LNG and so on. So, what I would say we need to do is to focus on those strengths. And that's kind of agnostic. You don't need to form a view about whether we're going to be doing more of this mineral, more of that mineral, whether we're going to be technology, manufacturing, all these things. If we have a well-educated population, we're open to foreign investment, to bringing in the right sort of skills. If we have sort of flexibility and adaptability in what we do, then we're going to be successful across all of those things, Joe.
There's a great quote in your book here. Is Helmut Schmidt right? People with vision should see a doctor.
I think that gets to that Australian scepticism,
Yes.
and I think again it served us well. We if you contrast the UK, where they've swung from Corbynism to Liz Truss to all these things, and America obviously has this great polarization and so on. I think there's something very healthy about that Australian attitude of, well, hang on a minute, let's just think this through, before we kind of get carried away.
Well, and let's talk about risk, because you do say we're safety first people, and sceptical pragmatists, quick to borrow, reluctant to delay gratification, prefer dividends to growth potential. Australian companies underinvest in R&D, and tech founders are quick to cash out. Equally, as a flip side, I think we see less failure, really.
Yep.
We don't see as much failure as overseas. So you just talk about that and risk and the risk profile.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the chapters in the book, looks at this question of what is an Australian. What is different about our values, I guess, and the way we approach things. And there's an interesting group called the Hofstede Institute, which does. They
sound interesting.
Yeah, they do these studies of different countries, look at almost like a personality test. Countries, are you more hierarchical or egalitarian, long-term focused, short-term focused? And you'd be unsurprised that Australia is high on being egalitarian. We're quite short-term, is that thing that you were just reading, quite indulgent in the way we approach things, but actually also quite what they call task focused, so quite achievement focused. There's a sort of a hard edge to Australians as well, which is positive. But one of the characteristics that comes through there is that we're kind of right on one end of the scale in being safety focused and risk conscious, and that can be a good thing. We were the first country in the world to have compulsory seatbelts in cars and helmets and pool fences and all these sorts of things, and there's obviously a benefit that comes to that security, but unfortunately it does also lead to very prescriptive legislation, regulation, and a conservatism, I think, in boards that, as you say, people don't take the type of risks that sometimes are important to take.
And our insolvency laws, at least, are very punitive.
Yep.
Here. Now we're all hopeful for change there.
Yep.
Your book says safety first. Focus has a flip side. Innovations are slow to get to market. Boards spend more time on risk than other countries. I know that. New innovation is seen through the prism of what can go wrong rather than what can go right. And you kindly reminded us of that great Barry Humphries quote. To live permanently in Australia is rather like going to a party and dancing all night with your mother.
Yeah. No, and I think fortunately, we do have the fortune that most Australians are able to travel, whether it's to Bali or Thailand or further afield, and that and the fact that a lot of Australians go overseas during their careers, I think reflects that as well. That people feel that sometimes in order to swing for the fences in the way that they want to do, or to stand out and achieve great things, sometimes they do have to go overseas. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to make sure that we are open to people coming back and bringing those technologies and skills and ideas and things that they've picked up back to Australia.
You talk also about moonshot projects. Australia fails at implementing big projects. Many nations do.
Yeah.
And you also talk about sort of well-intentioned efforts to future-proof the nation and a lack of ability to see black swan events.
Yeah.
Let me talk about that in the context of climate policy in Australia.
Yeah.
Are we overreaching with what we're doing in climate policy?
Yeah, so I think climate is a really interesting one, or energy generally, and the energy transition. We had a period where it looked like there was a bipartisan consensus around I think what every economist would say is the most sensible thing, which is that you put a market-based price on carbon emissions, and then you let the market sort out what's the right way for the transition to happen. Is it going to be nuclear? Is it going to be a bit more solar? Is it going to be wind? What's the different combination going to be? Unfortunately, that didn't get through, mostly because the Greens unfortunately wanted that price to be punitive rather than sort of market based, and you then ended up with this flip that we've just had. These big flips and a great deal of uncertainty nationally. It would obviously be a good thing if we could have a consensus in Canberra around what the policy settings look like, so that people can actually make long-term decisions about these investments. Fortunately, though, Canberra is not as all-encompassing and important as sometimes I think people think, and your average company has got on with making investments. We've moved from sort of less than 10% renewables to 40% renewables. Lots of people have solar panels on their roofs because that's just something that sort of makes sense. So I think there is a course that we can steer that is not throwing away the benefits that we have of having all this cheap energy, but at the same time does move us towards a position of having a greater diversity of supply and more energy autonomy as well, because there are some benefits to having an electrification of the grid. So.
And that requires leaders to actually be bought into our success, proper leaders to be bought into our success and managed from the future, from the centre.
Yes. No, I think that's right. And so, I think if you look at what China is doing, for example, is they are saying, okay, when it comes to energy, all of the above, So we're going to build massive numbers of solar panels. We're going to invest in nuclear power plants. But at the same time, we're not going to just shut down our existing energy, because it's important for any country to have cheap and reliable sources of energy. So we've got quite a high wire act in the next decade, particularly to find our way through all of that. And I think the most important thing is that people don't get too ideological about it. And we should see that great skeptical pragmatism come to the fore, and have a mix of a lot of different sources of energy.
Well, let's get completely ideological. So you've done a lot of work in Asia. You're the chairman of the Australia-British Commerce Chamber.
Yep.
Skeptical pragmatism. What is your view on the Republic debate? We won't see a referendum, obviously. I'm a proud monarchist, as you know.
Yeah.
What's your view on that? Do you think that's central to the Australian ethos and way of life, or do you think that Australians accept it isn't broken and we don't need to fix it?
Yeah.
How important do you think that is?
Look. I think it's more the latter, Joe. I mean, look, there obviously are people who have a very strong emotional connection with the monarchy, and on the other side,
don't take that out, Dom.
On the other side, there are a lot of people who have a very passionate desire to not have the monarchy. I think the vast majority of people in the middle sit there and say, does it really affect me negatively on a day-to-day basis? Probably not. And I think what we saw when it did go to a referendum was there was a majority support for a republic. Sounds like a good idea, but there was not a single model of what that actually looked like. And I think Australians quite rightly said, well, if we can't demonstrate that this new system of electing a president is actually going to be better, then let's stick with what we've got. As you say, if it ain't broke, then focus on other things.
R&D, focus on R&D again in companies. We do have an R&D rebate scheme in Australia that I think is largely speaking successful. Equally, I do see marginally solvent companies relying on R&D rebates to fund cash flow. Tell me about R&D. Where do we go with that?
So we do invest less in R&D than the OECD average, and it has continued to decline. As you say, the R&D tax credits overall, I think, has been a successful policy and has encouraged more investment in R&D, albeit that, as you say, it can be gamed and in some cases has not been productive. Where Australian companies have not, where Australia generally has not been as good is translating all the innovation that happens in universities into companies or into actual products. So there is still an enormous amount of terrific R&D and innovation that happens, but that isn't being linked to the market opportunities. And part of that comes down to the incentives within academia, that you get paid based on the number of journals that you get published in, things like that, rather than by the actual outcomes that you get from that research. So I do think we need to get better at that. On the positive side, the amount of venture capital in Australia has gone up by a factor of 10 times in the last 10 years, as a result of the success of a lot of those first wave companies, the Atlassians and the Canvas and things like that. Those people are now reinvesting in the tech ecosystem. In Australia, there's one estimate that there's now 1 million people in Australia that are employed in the tech sector in a broad sense. So I'm actually hopeful, and I think the 20-something generation are more entrepreneurial than we were at that age. They've all got a side hustle, so overall I'm optimistic, Joe. In spite of those R&D statistics not being as strong as we'd like, I think there is the entrepreneurialism there, and if we can actually harness some of that innovation coming out of universities and actually apply it to companies, then I think we're actually very well positioned.
Yeah, and I think you talk about sharpening the saw a bit around those issues. If we get education right, get some of those linkages right, we actually do have a great future.
Yep. No, I think that's a general point that the good thing that emerges as you look into these things and you research the areas where we have gone a bit off track is that they're all fixable. You know, they just need us to break out of that complacency that says, we're kind of fine, and just say, well, we are fine, and objectively we do enjoy a better quality of life and standard of living than almost anywhere. But actually, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that doesn't require that much effort to be to sort of step it up another notch.
Yeah. Look, it's an incredibly positive book. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for coming and talking to me today. Yeah. I just want to wrap up by asking you 3 totemic Australian figures who have influenced you in your journey, and at least one from business.
Okay, no, that's interesting. I think. Look, I think. Yeah. Well, I mean, besides obviously Joe Hayes in the turnaround industry. Look, I guess I have been, when it comes to business, been most influenced, not surprisingly, by people that I've worked closely with and seen in proximity. So I would say there are a number of, really all of the 3 Macquarie CEOs during the period of time that I was involved at Macquarie, Alan Moss, Nicholas Moore, Shamara Wickramaniyaka, all tremendous business leaders and really created a culture of innovation, achievement, embrace of risk. As we talked about. I think going back a bit further in Australian history, some of the great mining leaders, the R.V. Parbos and Hugh Morgans and those sorts of people, I think clearly made an enormous difference to the prosperity of the country at that time, and I think it'd be great to see more of that kind of leadership in business.